The Huey skimmed the treetops as if trying to outrun the dawn. In the humid light of 1966, the jungle below looked almost peaceful, an unbroken canopy of green stretching to the horizon. But peace had no place here. Without warning, the first burst of machine gun fire rose from the darkness beneath the leaves, tearing upward in a violent geometry that shattered the illusion of safety. In an instant, the sky ceased to be sky at all. It became a killing zone. The side door was open to the wind, to the noise, and to fate itself. A 19-year-old door gunner leaned into the slipstream, his M60 hanging from a bungee cord that bounced with every vibration of the rotor. He swept the tree line for movement, tracking shadows that refused to hold still. At this altitude, at this speed, the boundary between hunter and target narrowed to a breath. He could feel the sense of visibility that every gunner learned to fear, an awareness that he was seen long before he could see. Before he caught so much as a silhouette, enemy rounds snapped through the fuselage. Metal sparked behind him. Fragments spun off into the air. The threat came not as a shape, but as a sound, a sharp reminder that the jungle did not shoot from where it looked alive, only from where it was waiting. The pilot shouted altitude changes, pitching the helicopter up and down in a jagged dance meant to confuse the gunners below. But the maneuvering only widened the exposure of the man by the open door. He had no armor, no shelter, only a harness strap across his chest, and the instinct to return fire before fear could take its place. A single tracer passed so close he could feel its heat in the corner of his vision, a streak of orange that wrote a brief sentence of mortality across the air. In that moment, he understood what veterans meant when they said the jungle erased distance. Here, danger lived inches away. Survivors would later say that the first seconds of an ambush decided everything. If a gunner lived through them, he had a chance. If he hesitated, the war made no room for correction. Many roles in Vietnam were dangerous, but few were shorter-lived, more exposed, or less understood than the young men who stood in the open doors of the Huey. And their story, like the wind that carried them, was only just beginning. The Huey's mission profile forced its pilots into a narrow band of air that offered no forgiveness and even less concealment. To deliver troops quickly and avoid the rising threat of anti-aircraft weapons, helicopters flew at 50 to 150 feet, an altitude low enough to feel the turbulence of the treetops. But this was also the range at which ordinary rifles became devastating. At such heights, the smallest movement on the ground could send a round into the cabin before anyone aboard realized a shot had been fired. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units studied these patterns with patient discipline. They learned the sound of the approaching rotors, the likely angles of descent, and the fixed routes that terrain often dictated. Before long, they began arranging overlapping kill zones along those predictable approach paths. A single helicopter might evade one ambush, but not the second that waited 100 meters beyond. The jungle became a geometry of traps, built not from wire or mines, but from lines of fire that converged exactly where the aircraft needed to be. In that environment, the door gunner became the most visible man in the sky. His silhouette was framed by the open doorway, an unmistakable outline of helmet, shoulders, and weapon, backlit by the pale interior of the cabin. For the fighters on the ground, this shape was not just a target, it was the target. The door gunner was the Huey's eyes and teeth, and eliminating him meant blinding the aircraft at its most vulnerable moment. As a result, incoming fire rarely centered on the fuselage. It tracked upward toward the doorway with astonishing precision. Even when the first rounds missed, they struck close enough to remind the gunner that he was being watched through jungle sights long before he ever saw the men behind them. To return fire, the gunner had to lean outward, stretching past the lip of the cabin to find an angle that cleared the rotor wash. The posture exposed the chest, neck, and head, areas no harness could shield and no reflex could hide. It was the price of firing effectively, paid in visibility. Body armor offered little comfort. The heavy ceramic plates of later wars did not exist here. Early flak jackets were designed for shrapnel, not the 7.6 tomb rounds hidden in the shadows of the tree line. Against rifle fire at such close distance, armor bought seconds at best, and sometimes not even that. Within weeks of sustained operations, commanders understood a grim truth. During hot insertions, the life expectancy of a door gunner was among the shortest of any role in the theater. And yet the missions continued because the war demanded it, and because a more dangerous challenge was already rising beyond the tree line, waiting for its moment to appear. The internal reports from 1965 were written without sentiment, yet the numbers carried a weight that no commentary needed to explain. Casualty charts showed a sudden rise among the crew-served weapon positions on helicopters, a spike so sharp that analysts initially suspected a recording error. But the pattern repeated across units and across provinces. The men at the doors were falling with unsettling frequency, long before the rest of the aviation community understood why. A deeper review revealed a stark truth. In ambush after ambush, it was the door gunners who absorbed the first burst of enemy fire. The timing was consistent. The helicopter descended, vegetation opened beneath it, and the earliest rounds stitched the doorway before striking any other part of the aircraft. Whether through training, instinct, or the simple logic of aiming at the most visible figure, the enemy focused on the gunner with almost mathematical precision. Pilots sat in armored seats that deflected the frontal arcs of rifle rounds. Crew chiefs, though equally exposed when they leaned out, were partially shielded by the cabin frame when seated. But the gunner had no such protection. He stood at the threshold between aircraft and jungle, suspended above the trees, framed in light as the helicopter maneuvered. In a war defined by ambush, he became the first target, and often the only one fully exposed during those initial, decisive seconds. As the tempo of missions increased, exposure multiplied. Each lift meant hovering in a predictable pattern. Each extraction meant slowing under fire. Each medevac meant returning to locations already compromised by earlier engagements. The job did not simply carry danger, it accumulated it hour by hour, flight by flight. Within command tents, quiet debates emerged over whether the position could remain sustainable. Some argued for redesigns, others for tactical adjustments, but all understood that the door gunner's vulnerability was structural, not procedural. Yet operational need outweighed every recommendation. Without gunners, the helicopter lost its ability to protect itself, and the war allowed little room for such loss. The statistics, cold, orderly, impossible to ignore, became the Army's first tacit acknowledgement. Few men could remain door gunners for long. And as those charts circulated upward, another question began forming, one that would shape the next phase of the conflict. Early doctrine entered Vietnam with a kind of optimism, an earnest belief that superior firepower applied at the right moment could suppress an ambush before it fully unfolded. The theory had roots in earlier conflicts, where the side that delivered the first overwhelming burst often dictated the outcome. In briefings, officers spoke of fire superiority as if it were a shield rather than a tactic. In the early months, many believed that if a helicopter unleashed enough rounds quickly enough, the jungle would fall silent long before the enemy found its aim. At the center of that confidence stood the M60. Belt-fed, air-cooled, and capable of firing up to 600 rounds per minute, it far outmatched the bolt-action rifles still common among many Vietnamese fighters. In controlled tests, the M60's sustained bursts cut through brush, trees, and makeshift cover with ease. On paper, it allowed a single gunner to dominate an entire section of terrain. Pilots and crew chiefs saw it not just as a weapon, but as reassurance, steel embodied as certainty. With these numbers in mind, commanders nurtured an idea that felt logical, even comforting. An aggressive door gunner could intimidate ambushers into breaking contact. If the first seconds of an attack determined survival, then flooding those seconds with overwhelming noise and fire might prevent the enemy from completing their own plan. Some units adopted an almost ritualistic approach, firing long warning bursts into suspected landing zones in hopes of interrupting hostile preparations. The belief took hold that boldness itself had a suppressive effect. This confidence blended seamlessly with another assumption, that speed equaled survival. Helicopter crews arrived in Vietnam, convinced that their velocity and maneuverability insulated them from dangers that plagued slower, ground-bound forces. The Huey's rapid shifts in altitude and direction felt like protection, as if motion alone made it harder for the enemy to lead their shots. Many entered the war believing that the helicopter's greatest armor was the air flowing past its rotors. The emerging concept of air cavalry amplified this mindset. Borrowing language from earlier centuries, the term suggested that mobility conferred its own immunity, an echo of mounted units that avoided danger by outpacing it. In the air, crews felt this analogy even more strongly. They hovered only for moments, touched down briefly, and vanished again into the sky. To those inside the cockpit, the idea that such motion could be pierced by ground fire felt counterintuitive, almost contradictory. Pilots placed deep trust in that movement. Training emphasized constant adjustment, shifting headings, modulating altitude, and banking away from predictable lines of fire. Many believed that these techniques made them elusive targets, too fleeting for a rifleman hidden among the trees. The forward motion of the aircraft created a comforting illusion. That precision was difficult, and therefore unlikely for the enemy. Yet these assumptions, grounded in earlier wars and reinforced by early doctrine, would soon prove dangerously out of step with the realities of guerrilla tactics in Vietnam. The enemy did not need long engagements, broad targets, or perfect timing. They needed only a moment, a steady aim, and an understanding of where the helicopter had to be. And in the dense canopy below, that understanding was spreading. In the opening months of 1965, new air cavalry units stepped off the transports with an impression shaped more by expectation than experience. Early missions recorded few losses, and the reports that filtered back to bases in the United States painted a portrait of unprecedented mobility. To many, it seemed the helicopter had rewritten the logic of war. Vertical lift allowed forces to bypass ambushes, reinforce remote positions, and strike from angles no enemy could predict. The absence of significant casualties created a dangerous illusion that the aircraft's arrival had shifted the balance permanently and that its vulnerabilities were few. The Huey, sleek and unmistakable, quickly became the icon of this belief. Its approach announced itself long before it appeared through the treetops, a deep, rhythmic thumping that sent dust rising from the roads and water rippling in the paddies. In the early war, that sound felt like reassurance. Villages turned to watch it pass overhead. Troops climbing aboard sensed they were entering a machine that carried both strength and certainty. To many who flew in it, the Huey was not just transportation. It was a declaration of American reach, fast, loud, and seemingly unstoppable. For the young door gunners, confidence settled easily on their shoulders. The M60 hanging at their side offered a kind of psychological armor. Its continuous fire and belt-fed endurance created the impression of a protective curtain, a moving wall of steel that nothing could cross. Gunners were taught to sweep the terrain methodically, to establish dominance through noise and volume. In their minds, control of the air translated into control of the battlefield. Training reinforced this conviction. Early instruction emphasized offensive fire, rapid response, and aggressive overwatch of troop movements. Little time was spent on defensive planning at the door, or on the subtleties of an enemy who blended so naturally into the landscape. Recruits practiced firing positions, reloading drills, and coordinated bursts, but rarely the discipline of restraint or the patience of scanning an environment shaped by an unseen opponent. Confidence grew not only from firepower, but from the belief that firepower alone solved most problems. In the highlands and along broad river valleys, the doctrine appeared to hold. Missions flown over open terrain saw ambushes dissolve under concentrated fire. Enemy fighters struggled to track fast-moving aircraft across exposed ground. These early successes carried weight. They validated assumptions and encouraged the belief that mobility and shock were the defining advantages of the new war. Each landing zone secured without resistance added another brick to the myth of invulnerability. But with time and distance came experience, and veterans would later admit they had underestimated the enemy's capacity to adapt. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong studied patterns, altered tactics, and shifted weapons to exploit the helicopter's predictable routes. What had felt like a decisive advantage slowly revealed itself as a temporary one. The jungle was not a static opponent. It learned, observed, and answered. The belief in technological dominance did not shatter in a single moment. It eroded gradually, each engagement removing a layer of certainty. And as the war deepened, the Huey's crews would soon discover how quickly confidence could turn into exposure, and how swiftly the myth of invulnerability could be undone. They watched first. Long before they fired, Viet Cong units spent months observing the rhythm of the helicopters that crossed their valleys and river gorges each day. They noted the ARC's pilots preferred when approaching a landing zone, the altitudes that offered the smoothest ride, and the small adjustments crews made when lifting out under weight. Patterns emerged, predictable, repeatable, and exploitable. What looked like improvisation from above revealed itself on the ground as habit, and habits became targets. In this quiet study of movement, the foundation of a new threat was laid. Earlier in the war, many attackers aimed instinctively at the pilots, but experience taught a different lesson. The gunner's silhouette, upright, exposed, framed by the rectangular doorway, proved far easier to hit. Against the shifting angles of a turning aircraft, the gunner's position remained a fixed point. He leaned outward, torso clear of cover, helmet catching the light, arms locked around the M60. Vietnamese marksmen began to adjust their sights accordingly. A single decision, shifting their aim a few feet aft, changed the mathematics of each engagement. Their weapons varied in age and origin, yet all were deadly at close distance. The common 7.62 times 39 rounds of AK pattern rifles, the higher volume of the RPD light machine gun, and even older French arms left behind after colonial wars created a diverse but effective arsenal. The ambushers needed no standardization. They needed only proximity and discipline. In the dense tree line, even antiquated rifles could pierce the thin aluminum skin of the Huey, and at 50 to 100 feet, the difference between modern and obsolete mattered far less than the steadiness of the shooter. The most effective units coordinated their bursts with remarkable precision. They waited for the subtle deceleration all helicopters required when approaching a landing zone, a shift in engine pitch, a vibration in the rotors, a brief flattening of the flight path. In that instant, as the aircraft lost speed, volume, and momentum, the attackers opened fire. A half-second earlier or later, the burst might scatter harmlessly. Timed correctly, it struck the doorway with concentrated force. These were not long engagements. They were moments compressed into violence. By then, the American conviction that movement itself offered protection had begun to unravel. The jungle did not struggle to track a fast-moving aircraft. It simply waited for the moment when the aircraft had no choice but to slow. What had once felt like immunity now revealed its fragility. Maneuvering, once trusted as a shield, proved insufficient against opponents who understood the limits of a helicopter's performance envelope. As a result, door gunners, symbols of airborne dominance, the visible guardians of the Huey, became the focal point of nearly every ambush. Their position, once associated with control and confidence, turned into the most vulnerable seat in the sky. They were the first to see the threat, the first to fire, and too often the first to fall. The war had entered a stage where confidence, once an asset, began to turn into liability. And in the dense canopy below, another shift was already taking shape, one that would challenge every assumption the crews believed they understood. They were young, astonishingly young. Many of the men who stepped into the Huey's doorway were barely out of high school, chosen not through seniority or experience, but because they scored well on weapons tests during basic training. A few months earlier, they had been students, apprentices, or part-time workers. Now they were responsible for the aircraft's heaviest gun, its final line of defense, and the lives of everyone inside. The transition was abrupt, and for many, impossible to fully comprehend until the rotor wash hit their face for the first time. Their first missions carried a sensory overload that words could only approximate. The helicopter vibrated in every bone of the body. The heat pressed in from all sides, thickened by jet exhaust and jungle humidity. The noise was unbroken, a metallic thunder of blades striking air at 324 revolutions per minute. Beneath them, the canopy became a green blur stitched together by rivers and clearings that vanished as quickly as they appeared. For a 19-year-old standing at the open door, the world narrowed to a handful of impressions: movement, chaos, expectation, and always the knowledge that someone below might already be taking aim. Veterans would later describe a subtle moment of transition, one that arrived weeks or months into a tour. In the beginning, adrenaline masked everything: fear, uncertainty, even fatigue. But eventually the missions formed a rhythm. Familiar procedures replaced novelty, and actions became automatic. In that clarity, fear returned not as panic, but as recognition. The gunner understood not only the job, but the danger embedded in every second of it. Routine removed the veil. What remained was the steady awareness of how thin the margin truly was. Repeated exposure forced its own psychological toll. No other role in aviation placed a young man at the edge of an aircraft for hours each day, visible from every angle, unshielded by armor or enclosure. The threat did not come at intervals. It preceded every takeoff and lingered through every landing. Even when missions ended without contact, the anticipation itself hollowed out a portion of the mind. The strain was cumulative, Bill. Flight by flight, ambush by ambush, until the difference between relief and exhaustion became difficult to distinguish. To manage the tension, many created their own quiet rituals. Some carried small objects in their pockets, stones from home, medals, folded letters, that offered comfort no doctrine could provide. Others adjusted their stance in the doorway, angling their shoulders or tilting their helmets in the belief that it reduced exposure by an inch or two. These gestures were rarely discussed aloud. They were private negotiations with risk, small strategies, for reclaiming a sense of agency against an enemy they could not always see. Despite the individual strain, the bonds within a crew became unusually strong. Pilots, crew chiefs, and gunners depended on one another with a depth that transcended rank or background. A gunner trusted the pilot to read the terrain. The pilot trusted the gunner to keep the aircraft's flank clear. Each understood that survival hinged on another's decisions in moments too brief for discussion. In that shared vulnerability, friendships formed quickly and deeply, shaped less by conversation than by the silent recognition of mutual reliance. Yet beneath every mission lay a more private struggle, one not found in manuals or daily reports. These young men balanced duty with the constant nearness of mortality. They learned to operate in a space where fear and responsibility coexisted, neither canceling the other. Their courage rested not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to step back into the doorway each time the rotors began to turn. And as the war evolved, the pressures on these 19-year-olds would only intensify, driven by forces far beyond their control, forces gathering quietly in the next phase of the conflict. They adapted because they had to. As losses mounted and the vulnerability of the doorway became undeniable, units across Vietnam began experimenting with ways to buy their gunners a few more seconds of survival. Some of the earliest attempts focused on firepower. Crews mounted twin M60s on improvised brackets, doubling the volume of fire at the cost of weight and recoil. Others fitted M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns to certain airframes, the weapon's heavy rounds cutting deeper into tree lines but reducing maneuverability. A few units tested electrically driven miniguns, their staggering rate of fire creating brief corridors of safety. These innovations were not part of official doctrine, they were solutions forged in the pressure of daily necessity. Protection soon followed. Mechanics began installing makeshift armor plates on the cabin's interior, cutting sections from damaged vehicles or discarded equipment. These panels were bolted to the sides and floors to blunt incoming rifle rounds, though gaps remained wide enough for danger to slip through. The modifications added weight, altered center of gravity, and sometimes reduced lift capability, but crews accepted those trade-offs without hesitation. Each new plate represented one more obstacle between a gunner's body and the bullets that sought it. Even the weapon mounts evolved. Instead of fixed hardpoints, many units turned to bungee cords suspended from the cabin roof to support the M60. Simple though it was, this solution allowed the gun to be moved quickly from angle to angle, absorbing recoil and reducing arm fatigue during long missions. Door gunners quickly came to rely on the bungee system. It offered a form of fluid stability that felt intuitive in the turbulence of low-altitude flight. In an environment where seconds mattered, it gave them the precision needed to return fire in the chaotic first moments of an ambush. Pilots made their own adjustments, refining landing and extraction patterns to minimize exposure. Sharp flares before touchdown, sudden altitude drops, and unpredictable zigzag approaches became common. These maneuvers strained airframes and pushed the limits of the Huey's design, but they complicated the enemy's timing. By refusing to follow predictable glide paths, pilots forced ambushers to guess, not aim. Precision diminished when the aircraft moved in ways that textbooks never described. Inside the cabin, coordination evolved into an art. Crews rehearsed suppressive arcs that overlapped like the petals of a rotating fan. The gunner covered the near flank, the crew chief the rear quarter, while pilots adjusted position to open clear lines of fire. These rehearsals transformed the Huey into a moving fortress, its defenses dependent not on armor but on choreography. In dense terrain, where sightlines vanished without warning, such coordination often meant the difference between suppression and being overwhelmed. Additional protection arrived in the form of armored chicken plates, heavy ceramic vests worn by gunners to shield vital organs. The plates added weight, restricted movement, and made the already strenuous task of leaning outward far more difficult. Many N-ners disliked them, yet wore them nonetheless. In the cramped doorway, where visibility and reach mattered as much as protection, each man was forced to calculate his own balance between safety and effectiveness. Every modification, whether mechanical, tactical, or personal, bought the crew fleeting moments of advantage. A few seconds of hesitation from the enemy, a fraction of a second more to return fire, a sliver of protection between life and loss. Yet none of these innovations offered certainty. The helicopter remained exposed, the doorway remained vulnerable, and the gunner remained the first figure to be seen and the easiest to strike. Still, the effort continued, because in a war measured in moments, even the smallest improvement could shape the outcome of the next ambush, an ambush already forming in the shadows ahead. They improved the mounts, strengthened the armor, refined the tactics, but one truth refused to yield. No matter how advanced the machine or skilled the crew, the helicopter still had to slow down to land. That moment, brief, predictable, and unavoidable, remained the point at which the aircraft was most vulnerable. Every flare, every hover, every controlled descent created a window in which the helicopter's power diminished and the enemy's advantage grew. The engineering could evolve, the physics could not. The Huey's open door, essential for loading troops and evacuating wounded, could never be sealed. It was the helicopter's greatest strength, speed of access, immediacy of action, and its most persistent weakness. No armor plate could cover the space without eliminating the role entirely. As crews learned repeatedly, the door was both passage and target. The gap invited light, air, and danger in equal measure. It provided the gunner the visibility he required, even as it outlined his silhouette for every rifle in the tree line. Even the arrival of miniguns, with their astonishing rate of fire, could not fully counter a well-prepared ambush. Their rotating barrels spat thousands of rounds per minute, turning jungle undergrowth into shredded earth. Yet ambushers adapted. They dug firing pits beneath dense vegetation, masked their muzzle flashes, and waited for the precise instant when the helicopter's forward momentum faltered. A minigun could dominate a clearing once engaged, but it could not erase the threat that preceded engagement. The enemy's first volley still struck before the aircraft responded. Compounding the challenge was the simple reality of numbers. As helicopter operations expanded, their acoustic signature became familiar across the countryside. The rhythmic beat of the rotor blades, once a sound of surprise, grew predictable. Villagers, soldiers, and guerrillas alike learned to identify the approach long before the aircraft broke the horizon. Familiarity eroded whatever advantage novelty had once offered. By multiplying the fleet, the United States had multiplied the predictability of its movement. By 1967, the consequences were unmistakable. Statistical summaries from field units listed small arms fire as the leading cause of helicopter losses, not missiles, not mechanical failures, but rifles and machine guns fired from within the dense canopy. The reports carried a stark implication. The aircraft built to dominate the battlefield was being undone by weapons far older and simpler. This inversion was not lost on commanders, nor on the men at the doors who experienced it firsthand. Through it all, the role of the door gunner remained indispensable. He was the lookout, the early warning, the immediate response to enemy fire. Without him, troop insertions carried even greater danger. With him, the Huey gained a measure of deterrence and a chance, just a chance, to suppress the ambush before it matured. Yet this necessity placed him directly at the axis of risk. Each mission required him to stand where protection was least and where enemy fire was most concentrated. He became both guardian and target, courage and vulnerability embodied in a single figure. By late 1967, it was clear that the contest between innovation and exposure had reached an uneasy stalemate. For every tactical improvement made by helicopter units, the enemy adjusted with equal speed. For every new weapon mounted or maneuver developed, the environment imposed limits that no amount of ingenuity could overcome. The cost of this balance was measured not in theories or diagrams, but in casualties, men who stood in the doorway because someone had to. And as the stalemate hardened, the war pressed forward, carrying the crews toward a new and more complex phase, one where the enemy's response would shift yet again, and where the next challenge would emerge from an unexpected direction. The Tet Offensive arrived not as a single event, but as a detonation across an entire country. In the early hours of January 31, 1968, the scale of the fighting surged beyond anything aviation units had prepared for. Bases that once fell. T-Secure came under attack. Provinces that had seen only sporadic contact erupted simultaneously. Every helicopter on every flight line was pressed into service, lifting troops, evacuating wounded, and reinforcing isolated positions that had become islands in a rising tide of conflict. For the air crews, Tet was not a battle. It was a continuous demand for presence in skies thick with threat. Helicopters launched with minimal planning, often with no intelligence on enemy placement. The urgency of the moment replaced preparation. Aircraft flew into landing zones obscured by smoke, dust, or the burning edges of neighborhoods torn apart in hours. Some lifted off again before their engines cooled, turning the war into a blur of insertions and extractions performed under fire. What had once been measured, deliberate operations now unfolded at a tempo that left little room for strategy. In these conditions, the door gunners bore the brunt of the uncertainty, scanning for threats in terrain they did not have time to understand. During these mass insertions, their casualty rates climbed to some of the highest recorded in the conflict. The enemy no longer relied on isolated ambush teams hidden in the jungle. They deployed coordinated fire from multiple positions, striking at aircraft as they approached and again as they attempted to depart. Each gunner, leaning into the doorway for visibility, became an immediate target. In earlier fights, danger came from a single arc. During Tet, it arrived from many. The doorway, once a vantage point, became a crossroads of converging fire. Pilots later described the eerie moment when tracers filled the sky from multiple directions. Red, green, and white streaks arced upward, cutting through the dark with a mechanical precision that felt at odds with the chaos on the ground. Some aircraft flew through sheets of fire so dense that it seemed the night itself was aflame. The noise of impacts on the fuselage blended with the engine's roar until one could no longer distinguish between mechanical function and the violence hammering against it. For many, Tet offered the first experience of seeing entire sections of airspace illuminated by gunfire. Urban combat introduced new complexities. Cities that once shaped the movement of ground forces now dictated the survival of aircraft overhead. Fire came from rooftops, from windows, from alleys carved like channels between concrete walls. A helicopter hovering to deploy troops became briefly level with multi-story buildings, an angle of exposure no jungle ambush could create. The enemy exploited this immediately. Machine gun teams set up on balconies. Snipers positioned themselves behind shattered shutters. The air, once a relative refuge above the canopy, became a corridor of interlocking threats. Even the most experienced door gunners found themselves overwhelmed. Training had prepared them for bursts from the tree line, for muzzle flashes that flickered and vanished in foliage. It had not prepared them for the complexity of a city fight, where sound echoed unpredictably and shadows concealed entire firing teams. Returning fire required impossible judgment, choosing which direction posed the greatest danger when all directions seemed to be burning at once. The strain of these missions left many gunners with a sense that the rules had changed, and that their earlier instincts had become insufficient. Tet marked a turning point, a shift from scattered ambushes to coordinated, multidirectional firestorms that redefined the threat from below. The enemy had moved beyond reaction into orchestration, combining numbers, timing, and position to challenge the helicopter's mobility at every stage of flight. The air war no longer hinged on isolated moments of exposure. It had become a sustained test of endurance. And as aviation units confronted this new reality, they began searching for solutions that had not yet been imagined, solutions that would lead them into the next, more complex chapter of the conflict. The mission began with urgency, as most medevac calls did in February 1968. A small patrol had taken casualties during the chaos of Tet, and a Huey was dispatched to retrieve the wounded before nightfall closed the valley. The call offered no details on enemy presence, only coordinates and the assurance passed through several hands that the area was secure. For the crew, it was a familiar pattern, a small clearing, a short hover, a quick extraction. Yet on this day, the simplicity of the request masked the complexity of what waited below. As the Huey approached the clearing, the landscape appeared calm. The trees stood motionless in the late afternoon heat, their shadows long and unbroken. Smoke drifted faintly from a distant ridge, but no movement suggested immediate danger. The pilot slowed the aircraft, eyes scanning for wounded soldiers while the door gunner leaned outward, searching the perimeter for any sign of threat. The rotor wash pressed tall grass into spirals as the helicopter flared. Nothing in the moment hinted at what was about to unfold. The first shots came not as single bursts, but as a coordinated eruption. Multiple enemy positions opened fire simultaneously, sending converging lines of tracers toward the lowering aircraft. The clearing that had seemed empty seconds before now revealed its design. Muzzle flashes flickered among roots and shadows, emerging from dug-in pits invisible on approach. The sound struck the cabin like a physical blow, impacts ringing off the fuselage as the pilot instinctively pushed power into the blades. In an instant, the mission transformed from rescue to survival. The door gunner swung the M60 toward the densest fire, returning bursts into the brush. But the angles deceived him. Shooters were scattered in a semicircle, each hidden behind mounds of dirt and screened by vegetation shaped to mask their position. Every burst he fired forced another burst in return. His belt chattered through the feed tray as he searched for silhouettes that never fully revealed themselves. It was the dilemma of Tet made tangible. The gunner could see the threat only by the flashes of the weapons aimed at him. With rounds striking the tail boom and hydraulic lines showing signs of damage, the pilot lifted the Huey out of the clearing in a steep, uneven climb. The aircraft shuddered, its frame absorbing blows too numerous to count. In the doorway, the gunner slumped back as the crew chief pulled him inside. He had continued firing until the last second, absorbing the brunt of the ambush. Now, gravely wounded, he became the very casualty the mission had been sent to retrieve. Hours later, the after-action reports reconstructed the ambush in stark, unemotional detail. The clearing had been prepared long before the patrol ever called for evacuation. Enemy forces had carved narrow, firing lanes through the undergrowth, each one aligned with a likely approach path. These channels were invisible from above, concealed beneath the canopy, yet perfectly angled toward the point where the helicopter would flare. It was an ambush engineered with patience and precision, one that turned the air itself into a funnel of converging fire. Incidents like this medevac became defining symbols of the war's evolving character. They demonstrated how quickly advantage could disappear, how the familiar rhythms of flight could be shattered by a threat hidden in the quiet spaces between trees. In the doorway of the Huey, survival was measured not in minutes, but in seconds. And as crews absorbed the lessons of that day, they realized that the next mission might demand even more. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, another clearing waited, prepared with the same deliberate intent. By 1969, the war had entered a new and unforgiving phase. What had once been an asymmetric contest, an agile air force facing a dispersed guerrilla movement, had evolved into something sharper, more disciplined, and far more dangerous. U.S. helicopter crews now faced an enemy fully adapted to their movements. The patterns that once granted mobility had become legible to those watching from below. Each flight path, each deceleration, each flare had a meaning the enemy had learned to anticipate. Air mobility, once an innovation, now met resistance deeply embedded in the terrain itself. Much attention would later focus on the arrival of new weapons, SA-7 Strela missiles that appeared during the final years of the conflict. But the truth on the ground in 1969 was simpler and more sobering. It was not advanced technology that threatened the helicopters. It was small arms fire. The same rifles that had challenged colonial armies decades earlier continued to dominate the fight. Enemy units did not need altitude-seeking missiles when the aircraft descended to within a few dozen feet of the treetops. The closer the approach, the clearer the shot. In response, U.S. commanders issued a directive that reflected both experience and desperation. Door gunners were to fire continuously during the final approach to a landing zone. The goal was not precision but disruption, an attempt to force hidden fighters to keep their heads down long enough for the helicopter to touch down. Continuous fire turned the doorway into a storm of noise and muzzle flash, the gunner's belt feeding through at a relentless pace. It was meant to buy seconds. It rarely bought more. Enemy fighters, now thoroughly accustomed to the tactics of helicopter assault, countered with equal subtlety. Instead of returning fire immediately, they waited. They held their positions motionless as the curtain of suppressive fire swept above them. Only when the aircraft slowed, when the pilot committed to a descent with no room to accelerate, did they open fire. The pause cost them nothing and gained everything. In those final seconds, the helicopter's power diminished, its direction flattened, and its vulnerability peaked. Against such Ming, even the boldest gunner, could not maintain dominance. Increasingly, crews reported that many of the most accurate shooters were positioned at treetop height. Enemy units climbed into the branches before an operation, blending into the canopy where their sightlines aligned with the helicopter's descent path. From these vantage points, they saw not the belly of the aircraft, but its side, its doors, its gunners, its pilots. The angle removed much of the guesswork. AK-47 fire struck with unnerving precision, while RPD teams laid down lateral bursts that cut across the cabin openings. It was a geometry of attack that the helicopter could neither outclimb nor outmaneuver during its most delicate moment. The Huey, once the embodiment of American mobility, began to lose the aura it had carried so confidently in the early war. Its strength, speed, flexibility, range mattered little during the approach, where the terrain dictated every movement. What had symbolized advantage now offered predictability. The aircraft followed patterns because physics required it. The enemy targeted those patterns because experience enabled it. For the crews, this realization cut deeper than any mechanical failure. They understood they were stepping into danger, scripted by forces beyond their control. By the end of the decade, the climax of the air mobility experiment had revealed its harshest truth. Innovation could improve performance, enhance coordination, and extend reach, but it could not erase exposure. Door gunners stood where armor could not be placed and where tactics could not compensate for necessity. They were the first to sense danger and too often the first to absorb its consequences. The contest between helicopter and rifle had not favored the more advanced machine. It had favored the fighter who understood the landscape. And as 1969 closed, crews confronted a reality that changed the tone of every mission. The next landing zone would not grant mercy simply because they had survived the last. Each descent carried its own unseen resistance waiting patiently for the sound of approaching rotors. They carried the marks of survival in ways that were both visible and hidden. Many who stood in the doorway of the Huey returned with permanent hearing loss, the price of hours spent beside an engine that roared unceasingly and a weapon that hammered against bone. Burns from hot shell casings left small, patterned scars across their arms. Shrapnel wounds, some deep, others traced like threads beneath the skin, became reminders of moments in which metal entered the cabin faster than thought. These injuries were rarely dramatic enough to earn medals, yet they shaped every day that followed the war. But the deeper wounds were not physical. For men who spent their youth in the open air of a helicopter door, the mind learned a pattern that did not fade easily. The constant exposure to sudden, unfiltered danger created a psychological echo.